Life stories. Racist bikers target black soldier at bar, but his unexpected response shocks everyone. James Carter hadn't been home for long. Returning from 2 years in Afghanistan, he was still adjusting to civilian life. It was an odd feeling, both the relief of being back in Kentucky and the weight of being out of uniform, stripped of his mission. He parked his dusty truck in front of Maverick's Pub, a rustic dive just off Route 68. The neon sign flickered on the side of the building, casting a faint pink glow against the darkening sky. The place was a staple in this quiet town, a refuge for truckers, factory workers, and the occasional retiree, all looking for a cold beer after a long day. The bar wasn't fancy. It was a place where you could be left alone, where people didn't ask too many questions. James had come to unwind, not to deal with confrontations. His body still ached from the months of service. He didn't want to talk to anyone, just to sip his drink, think of home, and leave. As the truck's engine went quiet, James stepped out. The cool air of the evening wrapped around him. His boots made a soft thud against the gravel as he walked into the bar. The door creaked as he pushed it open, and immediately the sound of conversation and old rock music filled his ears. Johnny Cash was playing on the jukebox. Inside, the usual crowd was gathered. Rick, the bar owner, was polishing glasses behind the counter. A couple of locals were playing pool in the corner, while a few others were chatting over beers. It wasn't anything special, but it was familiar, a comfort to James after his long absence. He took a seat at the far corner, far from the bustling crowd. His camouflage uniform still hung loosely on his frame, a slight reminder of the work he used to do. He ordered a simple glass of water, hoping for some peace. His thoughts drifted to his family, the home-cooked meals his mom would prepare, and his niece's excited laugh. The thought of seeing them again filled him with quiet anticipation. The door swung open, and the soft chatter was interrupted by a loud group of men entering the bar. Their boots echoed on the wooden floor. James barely glanced up, his attention still focused on his drink. But he caught a glimpse of their leather jackets, insignias, patches, and a sense of authority in their step. Military veterans. James could always spot them. They were loud, boisterous, and filled with stories from their own pasts. One man in particular caught his attention, the leader, Tommy "Tex" Winters, a former Marine turned biker. His reputation was known across the region. His patch-laden leather jacket was worn and battle-tested, much like the man himself. Tex's loud voice boomed across the room as he laughed with his crew. James felt their eyes on him, but he didn't acknowledge it. He was used to being sized up, used to the judgments people made without knowing him. It didn't bother him anymore. He sipped his water, his eyes moving briefly toward the jukebox. But then, Tex stopped mid-laugh. His eyes locked with James, and the group fell silent. James had felt that shift before, the sudden attention, the tension in the air. Tex muttered something to his crew, and the group's laughter died down. Now, they were all looking at him. The stares were cold, judging. He didn't know what they were thinking, but he could guess. Tex made his way over, pushing through the crowd, and stopped at James's table, blocking the light. James looked up, unflinching. "Well, well, what do we have here?" Tex sneered, eyeing James's uniform. "That's a nice get-up. Where'd you find it? A Halloween store?" The men behind him chuckled, their laughter thick with mockery. James's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice steady. "It's mine," James replied, his tone calm but firm. "Earned it." Tex raised an eyebrow, looking skeptical. "Earned it, huh? Because that's funny. Real soldiers don't wear sneakers with their fatigues. You sure you're not just playing dress-up for sympathy?" James kept his composure, taking a slow breath. "I'm not here for sympathy or drinks. I'm just here to have a quiet night." The men around Tex snickered, one of them throwing in a remark about James not even knowing basic training. James didn't flinch. He'd heard worse in combat, and this was nothing. Tex leaned in, his breath strong with beer. "You think you're some kind of hero?" he taunted, his voice dripping with disdain. "You don't belong here. You're just pretending." James met his gaze unflinchingly. "I've served 3 tours overseas," he said, his voice steady but filled with a quiet authority. "And I don't need your approval to belong anywhere." For a moment, Tex hesitated. His smirk faltered under the weight of James's words, but his pride wouldn't let him back down. "Prove it," Tex scoffed. "Show us your tags. Otherwise, you're just a liar." James stayed calm, knowing this was a test. He didn't owe them an explanation, but he wasn't afraid to stand his ground. He knew exactly how to handle men like Tex. The room had gone completely still. The other patrons, who had been minding their own business just moments before, now watched the exchange with rapt attention. It was as if everything was waiting for something to break, for the tension to snap.
Tex's crew gathered around, closing in on James. The challenge in the air was thick, and James could feel his heart rate slow as his years of training kicked in. His posture remained relaxed, but his senses were sharp. He had seen situations like this before. The threat was real, but so was his control. "I don't need to prove anything to you," James said, his voice calm but steady. He met Tex's gaze, unwavering. Tex wasn't having it. The man's pride had been pricked, and now his bravado was flaring up. He didn't like being made to look weak, and no one, least of all a younger, quieter man like James, was going to embarrass him. Tex leaned in, his body towering over the table now. The scent of alcohol lingered on his breath. "You think you can just walk in here and act like you belong? Huh? We all know what happens to people like you. You've probably never even seen real combat," Tex spat, his voice a low growl. James stayed silent. He could feel the eyes of the room on him, but he didn't let it sway him. He wasn't here to start a fight, but if it came to that, he was ready. The group behind Tex was starting to murmur, their faces showing a mix of doubt and uncertainty. Frankie, the thinner biker, shifted uncomfortably. He wasn't as loud as Tex, but his body language showed that he was clearly having second thoughts. Even one of the older regulars at the bar, who had seen more than his fair share of trouble, glanced nervously at the scene unfolding. James leaned back in his chair, eyes locked on Tex. "You don't know me, and you don't know what I've been through," he said, his voice even but with a firmness that couldn't be ignored. Tex's smirk faltered for a moment, but then it came back, sharper, more menacing. "I don't think you're as tough as you make out," he said, his voice rising. "Let's see if your hands are as quick as your mouth." Suddenly, without warning, Tex lunged forward, grabbing at James's collar with both hands. It was a wild, uncoordinated move, the kind that screamed bravado more than skill. James's instincts kicked in. He sidestepped the grab, catching Tex's wrist in midair. In one smooth motion, he twisted Tex's arm behind his back, using his own weight to press Tex face first against the edge of the table. Tex let out a grunt of pain, his earlier confidence evaporating. The bar went completely silent. Even the jukebox seemed to slow as James held Tex down, his grip firm but controlled. "Next time," James whispered, his voice low but carrying across the now stunned room, "think twice before you start something."
The others in Tex's gang stood frozen, unsure of what to do. It wasn't often they encountered someone who could disarm their leader so easily, and it was clear they weren't prepared for the shift in power. Tex struggled beneath James's grip, his pride completely shattered now. He tried to push back, but his body was pinned. His face was pressed against the rough wood of the table, and the reality of the situation hit him like a ton of bricks. He was no longer the one in control. James kept his composure, his eyes scanning the room, watching for any sudden movements. The other bikers weren't sure what to make of it. Frankie shifted on his feet, unsure whether to step in or back away. "Tell him to calm down," James said quietly, his voice firm. "Tell him I'll let him go if he stops trying to make this worse." One of the men behind Tex, a quiet one with a beard, stepped forward cautiously. His hands were raised in an attempt at peace. "Hey man," he said, his voice shaky. "Let him go. He didn't mean nothing by it." James didn't move. His eyes were still locked on the rest of the group, his posture unchanged. "He came at me first," James said. "If you want him out of this, tell him to calm down." The bartender, Rick, had been standing by, his hand hovering near the phone. He stepped in, his deep voice cutting through the tension. "Maybe it's time you all head out before things get worse," he said, his tone matter-of-fact. "Ain't nobody looking for trouble here." Tex, still pinned, snarled. "You'll pay for this," he growled, his voice dripping with venom. "You don't know who you're messing with." James didn't flinch. His eyes remained cold. "I know exactly who I'm messing with," he said. "But you don't know who you're messing with either." The situation was reaching a breaking point, but just as James was preparing to let Tex go, the sound of a police siren wailed from outside. The red and blue lights cut through the bar's windows, casting sharp, flashing shadows across the room. Two police officers stepped through the door, Officer Karen Rhodes and Officer David Green. The room immediately went quiet. Everyone turned to face the officers, and all eyes were on them as they approached the scene. "Can someone explain what's going on here?" Officer Rhodes asked, her tone calm but authoritative. Tex was the first to speak. His voice was hoarse from the struggle. "This guy," he said, pointing to James, "he assaulted me, and he's impersonating a soldier." His finger trembled as he pointed toward the uniform. Officer Rhodes raised an eyebrow, her sharp gaze flicking to James. "Is that true?" she asked. James looked up, his face a mask of calm. "No, sir. He and his group confronted me because they didn't believe I'm a real soldier. When he tried to grab me, I defended myself." The room held its breath. The silence was suffocating as the officers surveyed the situation. One of the regulars, an older man who had been drinking at the bar, stood up and spoke. "I saw it," he said. "The soldier didn't start anything. Hank, that's his name, he came after him first, just like he always does." The officer nodded and turned to the bartender. "Is that what you saw, Rick?" Rick nodded, his face serious. "Yep, the soldier didn't do nothing wrong. It was Hank who started the trouble." The officers exchanged a look before Officer Rhodes addressed James. "Do you have any proof of your service?" she asked. James nodded and gestured to his duffel bag on the floor. "I've got my service uniform and ID right there. Feel free to look." The officer retrieved the bag and carefully opened it. Inside, James's military uniform, adorned with badges and insignia, was neatly folded. The officer inspected it briefly, then nodded to his partner. "He's clear," Officer Green said. "Thanks for your cooperation, sir." Tex, his pride bruised and his anger growing, scoffed. "You're just going to take his word for it? He could have faked it all." Officer Rhodes gave him a sharp look. "Enough. From what I've heard, you started this. You're lucky he isn't pressing charges for assault." Tex's mouth snapped shut as the reality of his situation sank in. His tough exterior had crumbled under the weight of the truth. The officer stepped back, surveying the room one last time before addressing Tex's crew. "We'll be filing a report about this," Officer Green said. "If you want to pursue your claims, you're welcome to do so, but you should know that false accusations are a serious matter." Tex gritted his teeth, but he didn't say another word. His crew shifted uneasily, some of them looking at the floor, others avoiding eye contact. With a final glare at James, Tex turned and stormed out of the bar, his crew following behind him in awkward silence. The room slowly began to return to its normal rhythm. The tension that had filled the bar just moments ago seemed to dissipate, replaced by the murmur of voices, the clinking of glasses, and the soft hum of the jukebox in the background. It was as if nothing had happened, though James knew that wasn't true. The incident had changed something, both in the bar and in him. The officers took one last look around, ensuring the situation was fully under control. With a quiet nod to James, Officer Rhodes spoke again, her voice low but reassuring. "Thanks for keeping your cool in there," she said. "We'll make sure everything is documented properly." James offered her a small nod in response. "I appreciate it, officer." Officer Green, who had been silently observing, gave James a small smile of approval. "You handled that well," he said. Not many people would have kept their composure like you did. Don't let these guys get under your skin. You did the right thing." As the officers left the bar, the last of the bikers filtering out behind them, the room seemed to relax. The regulars resumed their conversations, and the atmosphere returned to what it had been before: comfortable, familiar, and a little noisy. James sat back down at his table, his glass still untouched. His eyes were fixed on the empty space in front of him, his thoughts distant as he tried to make sense of what had just happened. This wasn't the first time he'd been confronted by ignorance and prejudice, but something about this encounter felt different. It was more than just a challenge to his service. It was a reminder of the struggles he'd faced and would continue to face as a military veteran. Rick, the bartender, came over to check on him. The man was a former Navy vet himself, and he had seen plenty of trouble in his years running the bar. He placed a hand on James's shoulder, his expression one of quiet understanding. "You all right, kid?" Rick asked, his voice rough but kind. James met his gaze, offering a small, tired smile. "Yeah, I'll be fine. Just not what I expected tonight." Rick chuckled softly. "Yeah, I can imagine. We don't get a lot of drama around here, but when we do, it usually comes with a leather jacket and a lot of attitude." He shook his head. "Don't let those guys get to you. You proved yourself, and that's all that matters." James nodded, appreciating Rick's words. "I just don't get it sometimes, you know? I've been overseas, seen the worst of it, and come home to this. It's like it never ends." Rick sighed, his hand still on James's shoulder. "I hear ya. It's tough out there, and it doesn't just end when you get back home. But you're doing the right thing by staying calm. Not everyone can do that." James thought about Rick's words for a moment before speaking again. "You think it'll ever change? People like Tex? People who can't see past their own pride?" Rick gave a small shrug, his eyes thoughtful. "Maybe, maybe not. But you don't change people by fighting them. You change them by showing them what real strength looks like. Strength in character, in calm, in knowing when to stand your ground and when to walk away." James looked around the bar, taking in the faces of the regulars, the patrons who had witnessed the altercation. Many of them had looked on in silence, some with concern, others with quiet respect. The tension that had once gripped the room was now replaced by a soft hum of normalcy, as if the storm had passed and the skies were clear again. "What happens if I don't walk away?" James asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "What happens if I fight back, if I push harder?" Rick met his gaze, his eyes steady and knowing. "Then you're just like them. The moment you become what they expect, you've lost the fight, even if you win the physical battle." James sat back in his chair, mulling over Rick's words. It wasn't an easy answer, but it was the truth. Fighting back, even when it seemed deserved, wasn't the same as standing up for himself. The real fight was finding the strength to walk away with dignity, no matter how much it stung. The door to the bar opened again, and James looked up. This time, it was a familiar face, Bill, one of the bikers from Texas crew. He walked in cautiously, his head down, almost as if he were afraid to face James after the confrontation. He was alone, his usual swagger absent. Instead, he looked apologetic. Rick raised an eyebrow, glancing at James. "Looks like we've got some unfinished business." James didn't say anything right away. He just watched Bill, waiting to see what he would do. Bill hesitated for a moment, his hands shoved into his jacket pockets. He took a deep breath and walked over to James's table. I wanted to talk to you," Bill said, his voice quieter than usual, "about what happened at the bar." James didn't speak at first, letting Bill continue. He wasn't sure where this was going, but he wasn't about to jump to conclusions. "I know I didn't stop it," Bill said, his voice filled with guilt. "I should have stepped in when Tex started running his mouth, but I didn't, and I've been thinking about it a lot. You didn't deserve any of that." James leaned forward slightly, his arms crossed as he studied Bill. There was sincerity in the man's eyes, something he hadn't expected. It was rare to see someone admit fault, especially someone like Bill, who had been so quick to follow Tex earlier. "I wasn't right to go along with Tex," Bill continued. He's got this way of getting under your skin, making you feel like you have to go along with him. But what you did, I respect that. You stood your ground. James nodded slowly, his gaze softening. You're right, you should have stopped him. But I get it. Some people, they're just too caught up in their own pride to see the bigger picture. Bill shifted uncomfortably, his hands fiddling with the hem of his jacket. I know it doesn't fix anything, but I wanted to apologize. Not just for what happened, but for going along with it. You didn't deserve any of it. For a moment, James said nothing. The weight of the situation was still there, still hanging between them. But something about Bill's sincerity felt genuine. It wasn't easy to come back and apologize like this, especially after everything that had happened. I appreciate you coming here, James said quietly. It doesn't change what happened, but it's a start. Bill's shoulders relaxed, and a look of relief washed over his face. Thanks, man. I mean it. He turned and started to walk away, but before he left, he glanced back at James. I want to be better. I don't want to be the guy who just follows along with the loudest voice anymore. James watched Bill leave, the sound of the door closing softly behind him. For a moment, the weight of it all lingered, but something shifted. Maybe Bill's apology wasn't the answer to everything, but it was a step in the right direction. James sat there for a while, thinking about the events of the past few days. The encounter at the bar had been uncomfortable, painful even, but it had also shown him something important. People weren't just defined by their mistakes, they were defined by how they learned from them. Bill had learned something that night, and maybe, just maybe, it was a lesson that would change the way he approached the world. For James, the journey wasn't over. The battles he fought weren't always physical, and sometimes they didn't have clear winners or losers. But the real victories? Those were the moments when people took responsibility, when they recognized their flaws, and when they tried to be better. And maybe, in the end, that was all anyone could ask for. The story of James Carter's encounter with Tex and his biker crew highlights several important life lessons, particularly about integrity, standing up for oneself, and the power of personal growth. James exemplifies the value of staying calm and composed in the face of judgment and prejudice. His ability to not escalate the situation, despite being provoked, demonstrates strength not in physical power, but in emotional control and self-respect. The story also reflects how people, even those who initially seem antagonistic, can change if they are willing to acknowledge their mistakes, as seen through Bill's apology. This teaches us that growth and reconciliation are possible when we take responsibility for our actions and make an effort to learn from them. In a world where pride and ego often drive conflict, the story shows that true strength comes from humility, self-reflection, and the courage to do what is right, even when it's hard. Ultimately, it's about recognizing that the real battles aren't always fought with fists, but with the choices we make in how we treat others and ourselves. The story of James Carter's encounter with Tex and his biker crew highlights several important life lessons, particularly about integrity, standing up for oneself, and the power of personal growth. James exemplifies the value of staying calm and composed in the face of judgment and prejudice. His ability to not escalate the situation, despite being provoked, demonstrates strength not in physical power, but in emotional control and self-respect. The story also reflects how people, even those who initially seem antagonistic, can change if they are willing to acknowledge their mistakes, as seen through Bill's apology. This teaches us that growth and reconciliation are possible when we take responsibility for our actions and make an effort to learn from them. In a world where pride and ego often drive conflict, the story shows that true strength comes from humility, self-reflection, and the courage to do what is right, even when it's hard. Ultimately, it's about recognizing that the real battles aren't always fought with fists, but with the choices we make in how we treat others and ourselves.
If you found this video helpful or thought-provoking, don't forget to give it a thumbs up. It really helps more people discover our content.
And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss the latest updates from our channel. Thanks for watching. We will see you in the next videos.